Josef Mengele, a historical figure, was born in the southern German city of Günzburg on March 16, 1911. Prior to Josef's birth, Karl Mengele, his engineer father, had acquired a foundry specializing in the production of agricultural machinery for tasks including sawing, milling, and cutting. With a workforce of 7 male employees during the early 1910s, the Mengele's family was among the wealthier households in the Günzburg region. Karl Jr. and Josef were born to Walburga Hupfauer, Josef's mother, who was also the birthplace of both younger siblings. In addition to Alois, young Josef was raised in a global community engulfed in the midst of a total conflict. Germany's recognition as a sovereign nation occurred only recently. Until the 1860s, the region in question was fragmented among more than 21 smaller republics. In 1871, however, these fragmented under the leadership of Prussia to create the German Empire. This significantly upended the equilibrium of power in Europe, and the continent veered towards conflict in the decades that followed. In an effort to counterbalance Germany's ascendancy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Britain, France, and Russia formed alliances with Germany. Initially, these superpowers limited their disagreements to proxy conflicts in Africa and the Balkans. However, a regional dispute in the Balkans during the summer of 1914 sparked a general European war. It rapidly grew to include nations like Japan. Thus, the outbreak of the First World War occurred. It spanned more than 4 years, during which time the Ottoman Empire, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and France opposed Britain, Italy, and Russia. The United States eventually sided with them. The German Empire came to an end with the triumph over the Weimar Republic, which was subsequently renamed in honor of the capital city. Significantly, Germany was subjected to a series of punitive peace conditions as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles, which would have enduring consequences. It is possible that the infant Mengele was not completely oblivious to these events, given the significant impact they had on the Mengele household. Following the onset of the conflict, Karl enlisted in the German army, leaving Walburga with the responsibility of childcare and maintaining the business operations while the war raged. She accomplished this with resolute resolve and effectively negotiated an agreement with the German government for the production of a Vorratswagen, a specific category of military vehicle intended for deployment on the front lines. Consequently, the organization thrived, and upon Karl Mengele's post-war return to Günzburg, he successfully sustained the company's progress. It had risen to the position of the third greatest manufacturer of threshing equipment in Germany by the beginning of the 1920s. The organization's establishment required the assistance of extended family members. Consequently, the Mengele name continues to be widely recognized in the Günzburg region. Karl Mengele Strasse, an important thoroughfare in the town, serves as an emblematic contrast between the civic importance attributed to the Mengele family as a whole and the abhorrent atrocities perpetrated by the eldest son of Karl and Walburga Mengele. More practically, this affluence that Josef enjoyed during the 1920s enabled him to pursue extensive academic endeavors with financial support. Mengele achieved a degree of academic accomplishment during his adolescence. He developed extensive interests in music and physical activity and achieved artistic prowess. Skiing seems to have been his preference, given the proximity of the municipality to the northernmost point of the German Alps. During April 1930, Josef Mengele obtained a satisfactory grade on his high school examinations, albeit not an exceptional one. Initially, he appears to have contemplated pursuing a career in dentistry, observing the absence of a dentist in the vicinity and concluding that it would be a lucrative profession to enter. Subsequently, he determined that this was excessively specialized and instead pursued a medical career, specializing in anthropology and genetics. Evidently ambitious, his correspondence from this period reveals that he desired to establish himself as the family's inaugural medical scientist in order to make a favorable impression. Thus, he departed the family residence in October 1930 and traveled eastward to Munich, the capital of Bavaria. By enrolling in both the medicine and philosophy departments, He demonstrated an interest in broader inquiries and speculation as well as the hard scientific component of medicine. It was a jumble of interests that would ultimately produce horrifying consequences. Moments before Mengele's arrival in Bavaria, a nascent political party was establishing itself and gaining momentum in the region. A decade after its inception, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, came under the swift leadership of Adolf Hitler, an Austrian extremist. A group of disillusioned war veterans attempted a coup in Munich in November 1923. Their primary objective was to thwart the growth of leftist parties, including the Communists, and to rectify the excessively punitive provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, which had terminated the First World War. Fortunately, the coup attempt was swiftly thwarted. They subsequently resorted to constitutional politics in an attempt to attain their objectives, but initially encountered electoral setbacks. This continued until the autumn of 1929, when the Wall Street Stock Exchange endured calamitous losses, precipitating a global economic downturn following a decade of rapid expansion. As life savings and employment were shattered across Germany, political parties, including the Nazis and the Communists, witnessed an upsurge in voter support. During the early 1930s, as the Great Depression, which ensued after the Wall Street crash, persisted, Hitler and his associates gained increasing support with their xenophobic rhetoric and animosity towards Germany's global standing. Mengele quickly became entangled in the political upheaval that engulfed him, although he did not officially join the Nazi Party for some time. He became a member of the Stahlhelms, an ex-servicemen's organization named after the headgear utilized by the German army throughout the First World War, in March 1931. The Stahlhelms frequently organized military-style rallies and marches. Nonetheless, young Josef was initially captivated by the Nazis as well. Mengele later noted in his autobiography that university students, including those who had attained the voting age, had played a role in this Nazi triumph. I was not of voting age at the time. I believe my political leanings at the time were national conservative due to familial tradition. I had not become a member of any political group. However, I was undeniably captivated by the program and the National Socialists' entire organization. However, I remained an unorganized private individual for the time being. However, in the end, it became unfeasible to remain idly by during these politically turbulent times, provided that our homeland did not fall victim to the Marxist-Bolshevik assault. This straightforward political principle ultimately determined the course of my life. It would seem that Mengele's enlistment in the Nazis was an inexorable consequence of this development. The early years of Mengele in Munich coincided with the Nazis' ascent to power. Hitler and his associates emerged as the dominant political party in Germany by 1932, garnering 40% of the national vote in the Reichstag elections that took place that year. Despite this, the endeavor to establish a majority government in Germany remained futile during the latter part of 1932. The nation's allegiance at this time was between the Communists, the second largest political party in Germany, and the Nazis. It is highly probable that whoever were to acquire power would betray the Weimar Republic. The political and business establishment then entered into a Faustian bargain with Hitler and the Nazis in late 1932 and early 1933, consenting to induct Hitler and a number of his senior colleagues into the government under the erroneous impression that they could exert control over him and his party. It was a calamitous underestimation, and the Nazis immediately sought absolute power after gaining entry. A pretext was devised to legitimize the enactment of an enabling act, which essentially granted Hitler the authority to rule by decree in his capacity as Chancellor. Therefore, within a brief span of months during the initial 6 months of 1933, the Nazis successfully annexed complete authority across Germany and instituted a one-party state that remained in power for the subsequent 12 years. Mengele became progressively preoccupied with his studies by 1934. However, numerous contemporaries later stated that they never considered him to be an exceptionally proficient scholar. However, many would observe that he compensated for his modest intelligence through diligence and ambition. Midway through the 1930s, Mengele pursued a doctorate while concurrently working as a practicing physician due to his ambitious nature. The Stahlhelms, of which Mengele had been a long-time member, merged with the Sturmabteilung or Brown Shirts, the original paramilitary branch of the Nazi Party, during this period. Hitler had mandated the merger out of a fundamental mistrust of the Stahlhelms' monarchical nature. Mengele resorted to his studies more extensively after being compelled to sever his affiliation with the organization due to a severe renal ailment. In general, his academic endeavors yielded rewards. A dissertation entitled, Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of 4 Racial Groups, earned Mengele his doctorate in 1935. Here, Mengele argued that an individual's race could be ascertained solely through an examination of their mandible. Nevertheless, it is important to acknowledge that Mengele's conclusions were grounded in scientific principles during this period, and the thesis did not explicitly espouse any bigoted or anti-Semitic sentiments. This is noteworthy because it indicates that Mengele had not yet undergone the radicalization that would occur later on. After completing his dissertation and earning his doctorate, Mengele undertook a limited period of practice as a junior resident doctor for a few months. This obligatory service was a prerequisite for him to obtain a full medical license. It was during this period, in 1939, that he entered into matrimony with Irene Schönbein, whom he had met while employed in a Leipzig hospital. Rolf, their one and only son, was to be born in 1944. Although Mengele's personal life had flourished, the lengthy hours and ward rounds of a resident physician's duties rendered him unfit for the position. He was also anxious to get back to his studies. In January 1937, he successfully secured a research assistant position at the University of Frankfurt's Third Reich Institute for Heredity, Biology, and Racial Purity. This was in pursuit of his objective. At this institution, he would receive instruction from Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a Hitler admirer who claimed to be an authority on the ominously named concept of race hygiene. It is precisely during this period that Mengele developed increasingly abhorrent perspectives and his character was undoubtedly tainted. His previous thesis, although he had demonstrated an interest in race and genetics, had not been explicitly prejudiced up until this juncture. After immersing himself in Nazi racial ideology in Frankfurt, he submitted an application to the Nazi Party in May 1937 and was accepted as one of 5,574,974 members the following year. During the latter part of the 1930s, Mengele and von Verschuer maintained a close working relationship. Frequently, they collaborated on reports for courts convened by the Nazi regime to adjudicate German Jews accused of violating the Nuremberg laws, a set of repressive policies implemented in the mid-1930s to deny voting rights to the Jewish populace of Germany. This involved medical evidence that was rather peculiar. For example, defendants were frequently brought before the court to determine whether or not they had Jewish ancestry. If they did, it would have constituted a violation of one of the Nuremberg laws. Mengele and von Verschuer would perform physical examinations on certain defendants, including assessments of the defendant's nose and other facial features, with the intention of ascertaining the defendant's Jewish heritage. This is a clear departure from Mengele's perspective. His research in Munich was conducted using valid scientific methodologies, and he produced work that, according to the consensus of historians and other scholars, was unproblematic even by contemporary standards. Conversely, during the latter part of the 1930s, Frankfurt witnessed a decline into unfounded racial theories that were founded upon Nazi ideology. Undoubtedly, his tenure in Frankfurt had instigated a substantial transformation of personality. Regardless of the intricacies of his actual work, Mengele's position in Frankfurt facilitated his swift career advancement. Mengele was elevated to the position of assistant physician under von Verschuer subsequent to the completion of his medical degree in Frankfurt in 1938. At this juncture, Mengele initiated discussions on the notion that races and individuals could be improved through suitable selection. This clearly demonstrated that he had already wholeheartedly embraced the racial ideology of the Nazis. Politically, he was becoming increasingly entangled with the regime. He submitted an application for Schutzstaffel, SS, membership several months after affiliating with the Nazi Party. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, was one of the paramilitary organizations of the Nazi regime and was subsequently tasked with overseeing the proliferation of concentration camps throughout Central and Eastern Europe. His political life and professional work began to bleed into one another at the same time he joined the Waffen-SS, an elite subgroup of the SS. Additionally, he was affiliated with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and the Third Reich Institute, both of which were prominent in Germany for the study of eugenics and, as such, effectively mouthpieces for pseudo-scientific Nazi racial ideology. During this period, Mengele continued his research in the 1930s, while the Nazis pushed Europe towards conflict. Hitler and his associates had consistently expressed the objective of nullifying the provisions outlined in the Treaty of Versailles and re-establishing Germany's status as a major power in Europe. In contrast to the initial years following the Nazis' 1933 coup d'état, during which there was little overt effort to escalate aggression, this rapid progression commenced in 1936. During the spring of that year, the German army initiated remilitary operations in the Rhineland, a region that had been explicitly prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. Austria was subsequently annexed into a larger Germany in 1938. Additional annexations ensued promptly thereafter, commencing with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938. By early 1939, the subjugation of Central Europe had been substantially concluded, with the puppet regimes of Hungary and the remainder of Czechoslovakia being installed. Britain and France had already indicated that their previous appeasement of German aggression would cease, specifically in the event that Hitler attempted to occupy Poland. The consequence of Germany's invasion of its eastern neighbor on September 1, 1939, was the proclamation of war by Britain and France against Germany on September 3, 1939. The commencement of the Second World War had occurred. Prior to the imminent colossal conflict that would soon engulf Europe, Mengele encountered his first and only substantial obstacle during his time with the Nazis. After several years of courtship, he intended to wed Irene in the summer of 1939. However, the nuptials was marred by controversy, with some questioning whether his future wife had Jewish ancestry. Mengele sought the assistance of influential acquaintances and co-workers who assured the tribunal that rendered a verdict on these issues that Irene adhered to extremely Nordic customs. Despite an exhaustive search of records pertaining to the extended family spanning as far back as the United States, the issue remained largely unresolved. As a result, despite Josef's inability to provide conclusive evidence that he was not entering into matrimony with a woman of minimal Jewish heritage, he managed to deflect the question without providing a complete response. A grim irony exists in this situation, as the individual who would soon be dictating the lives of others on the basis of racial purity was denied a certificate by the Nazi regime attesting that his children were of pure Aryan blood. Mengele was ecstatic about the outbreak of war. Long after the First World War, his son Rolf would assert that his father had told him that he regarded the war as an essential struggle to reassert the German nation after years of being humiliated and despondent. Mengele immediately enlisted. Nevertheless, his recurrence of an old renal ailment in late 1939 prevented him from reporting for duty until the summer of 1940. During this period, the German panzer divisions were engaged in a furious military campaign across Western Europe. Mengele was initially assigned to a Kassel, central Germany, military base. As a member of the Waffen-SS, he was reassigned to a combat position after only a few weeks of his stay here. In doing so, he was bestowed with the sub-lieutenant rank of Untersturmführer. Mengele then spent the subsequent several months in occupied Poland, where he was affiliated with the genealogical section of the Race and Resettlement Office, whose mission was to evaluate the racial purity and, by extension, suitability of potential German colonists in Eastern Europe. The objective was to eradicate non-Germans from the Lebensraum, or living space, that was under construction in Eastern Europe. During Mengele's service in Poland, the war effort of the Nazi regime was proceeding smoothly. Following the initial invasion that occurred in September 1939, Poland was rapidly subjugated and occupied. Subsequently, during the winter and early spring of 1939 and 1940, Britain and France attempted to belatedly prepare for a German attack on France by engaging in a phony war. The approach of Hitler was gradual, and upon his arrival in the spring of 1940, his objective was the occupation of Denmark and Norway. However, during the early summer, a thunderbolt strike on France resulted in the rapid conquest of the northern region and the Low Countries within a few weeks. By the conclusion of the summer of 1940, the United Kingdom was the only nation standing in opposition to Nazi Germany. Subsequently, Benito Mussolini's Italy allied itself with Adolf Hitler's Germany, and an offensive was launched in North Africa against the British in an attempt to acquire Egypt and the Suez Canal. During the summer of 1941, this prospect appeared highly probable, as additional regions of Europe, such as the Balkans, had already been conquered by the Axis powers of Germany and Italy. Therefore, by mid-1941, the outlook for Winston Churchill and his government in London regarding the war effort was extremely grim. With the tide of war shifting in its favor, Nazi policy further deteriorated. With a growing assurance that they would soon attain dominion over Europe and would no longer be subject to external pressure from other nations, Hitler and the Nazi Party leaders began to consider implementing more severe anti-Semitic policies. During the years 1940 and early 1941, there was deliberation regarding the forcible relocation of millions of European Jews to Madagascar, an East African island, where they would be confined in an open-air prison. Nevertheless, as the North Africa campaign encountered setbacks and the likelihood of capturing the Suez Canal diminished, a considerably more audacious notion emerged. The final solution entailed the compulsory apprehension and deportation of Europe's Jewish population to a network of over a dozen concentration centers that had been established throughout Central and Eastern Europe ever since the outbreak of the war. A minority of the most physically capable individuals would be enslaved and forced to work in factories producing German war materials, but the vast majority would perish within hours of their arrival due to gas exposure. As soon as this strategy was ratified in January 1942 at the Wannsee Conference north of Berlin, mass murder ensued in concentration facilities including Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Mengele was subsequently assigned to the latter. In 1941, Mengele was scheduled to witness military action. In mid-1941, following an extended stay in Poland, he was transferred to the Eastern Front. Hitler, buoyed by 1940's triumph, issued the directive to his generals to commence preparations for the Soviet Union invasion. As it came to be known, Operation Barbarossa would be the most extensive land invasion ever executed by an army. Hundreds of thousands of German forces rushed across the border into the Soviet Union as the conflict began that summer. Initially, the invasion was greeted with tremendous success, as the German Wehrmacht advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad and the Soviet forces disintegrated. Nevertheless, over time, Joseph Stalin and his generals successfully mobilized their forces. However, the Russian winter soon followed. The German army lacked appropriate winter attire and was therefore unprepared for the extreme weather. As a result, the tide of war began to turn during the winter of 1941, when the German advance stagnated within a short distance of Moscow. In 1941, Mengele was deployed to this front, more precisely in Ukraine, and was decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class for his valor. Mengele continued to serve on the Eastern Front despite the fact that Germany was losing the war. He was appointed to the medical detachment of the Waffen-SS's Viking Division in January 1942. Eventually, this elite unit would infiltrate Russian territory to a greater extent than any other German military division. However, Joseph was prevented from approaching the front lines. Due to his significant value as a physician assigned to the division, he was redirected to the defensive lines, where the unit was engaged in clearing operations rather than spearheading efforts at the front. 5 days in July, The Viking unit was engaged in a fierce battle of attrition in the vicinity of the villages of Rostow and Bataisk. In the course of this specific conflict, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, a superior honor, for rescuing 2 wounded soldiers from a burning tank while the adversary was engaged in combat. After escorting the 2 individuals to safety, Mengele administered first aid to them. The Black Badge for the wounded and the Medal for the care of the German people were additional honors bestowed upon him. As a result, Mengele marched back to Poland in late 1942, having earned an extensive Medal of Honor for service on the Eastern Front. Mengele's repatriation to Poland was most likely not a coincidental development or a commensurate recompense for his valor in combat. It is more likely that his readmission from the Eastern Front was due to his former mentor, Professor von Verschuer, who in early 1942 was appointed director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. It was the responsibility of this institute to supervise Reich research pertaining to the theories of racial purity and eugenics. The implementation of the final solution and the subsequent growth of the concentration camp system resulted in an inexhaustible pool of subjects for scientific investigation within the camps. Moreover, the researchers were exempt from any repercussions regarding the methodologies they utilized in their purported research. Von Verschuer, while formulating his preparations to camper in concentration camps, had already indicated his intention to accompany a number of his former students and colleagues by the summer of 1942. It is highly likely that Mengele was among them, and von Verschuer may have arranged Josef's recall from the Eastern Front in mid-1942 with the specific intention of accomplishing this. Thus, following a brief hiatus in Poland, Mengele resumed his position at the institute in Berlin by January 1943. However, he was promptly deported to the location that has come to be associated with him, the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. During this time, it grew progressively more apparent to any German with a somber assessment of the strategic situation that the war endeavor was destined for failure. In the aftermath of the German defeat at Stalingrad, the Russian forces commenced a gradual retreat of the German legions from Russia. Furthermore, the United Kingdom, which the United States had joined in 1943 subsequent to its entrance into the conflict in December 1941, had already triumphed over the combined Italian and German forces in North Africa by the spring of that year. A southern front was established in Europe against the Axis powers in the summer of 1943, when the Western Allies invaded the island of Sicily as a prelude to encroachment on the Italian mainland via Operation Husky. In the interim, the Russians persisted in pressuring the Germans to retreat into Poland and Ukraine, and the D-Day landings in Normandy, France, established a Western Front in the summer of 1944. The demise of Nazi Germany at the hands of the Allies was at this point assured. However, the rate of Germany's retreat and the initial arrival of the Allied powers in Berlin remained uncertain. The prosecution of high-ranking regime members could have a significant bearing on this matter. In May 1943, Mengele, who had been promoted to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, captain, at that time, was assigned to Auschwitz. Initiated modestly shortly after Poland's conquest, the Auschwitz camp underwent a monumental transformation under the leadership of its commandant, Rudolf Höss, by 1943. 3 colonies were in existence. As the first camp established, Auschwitz I housed administrative centers, officers' quarters, and early detention facilities in construction. In essence, Auschwitz II or Auschwitz-Birkenau operated as a center dedicated to extermination or death. In shower rooms lacerated with the gas Zyklon B, Jews and other individuals dispatched here by the Nazi regime, including Roma nomads and Soviet prisoners of war, perished en masse. The remains were subsequently incinerated rapidly in crematoria constructed on site. In this factory of death, more than 1 million individuals, the majority of whom were Jews, perished from 1942 to 1945. The last camp, referred to as Auschwitz III or Auschwitz-Monowitz, was utilized as a labor station for slaves, primarily to produce synthetic rubber for the IG Farben chemical company. Mengele arrived at this expansive complex during the early summer months of 1943. On his arrival at Auschwitz, Mengele was bestowed with the esteemed position of chief physician of the Romani family camp by Eduard Wirths, the camp's chief medical officer. His function was diverse and vicious within the larger camp. The physicians stationed at Auschwitz played a pivotal role in the process known as the selection. This procedure was carried out on newly arrived individuals at the complex. Thousands of Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Romani, and other unfortunate individuals were physically examined on the gangway adjacent to the train platforms as they descended from their trains and entered the camp. The bewildered newcomers were unaware that the majority of those being evaluated by the physicians were being sentenced to death. A minority were chosen on the basis of their physical fitness and subsequently relegated to labor centers. A few others were selected for experimental research purposes or for other unique motives. However, the remaining individuals were all condemned to the gas chambers, where they perished within hours. The absence of any visceral reaction on the part of Mengele was conspicuously evident. Certain medical professionals stationed at Auschwitz harbored sincere aversions towards the selection duty, which entailed the execution of minors and the elderly. In contrast, Mengele would occasionally demonstrate up for the task on his day off. Mengele promptly shifted his attention to additional endeavors, which indicates a complete absence of any effective reaction towards the plight of others. This commenced virtually immediately upon his initial arrival at the Romani family colony to which he was assigned. A number of weeks following his initial arrival at Auschwitz, a Noma outbreak broke out in the Romani colony. This is an aggressive gangrenous process characterized by tissue death caused by both the initial infection and the subsequent lack of blood supply. It negatively impacts the lips and mouth in particular. While the primary objective of a conventional physician would have been patient care, Mengele's objective was to conduct scientific investigations into a disease that was relatively unknown during that era. Patients who displayed symptoms were segregated in distinct areas for the purpose of investigation. The most abhorrent aspect was the execution of a number of children afflicted with the disease, followed by the removal of their skulls and organs for transport back to the SS Medical Institute in Graz, Austria, for further analysis. Even as of the evening of August 2, 1944, when the decision was made to exterminate the entire Romani colony, this ominous investigation was still in progress after several months had passed. Other atrocities also occurred. Illnesses of various types were prevalent in the camps due to inadequate sanitation practices in general and the fact that individuals who arrived at Auschwitz frequently carried diseases due to the confined conditions of the trains that transported them to the death camp. Consequently, epidemics of maladies like typhus and scarlet fever were commonplace. The manner in which Mengele dealt with these epidemics was ruthlessly utilitarian. During one instance of a typhus epidemic, he ordered 600 Jewish women, the entire population of the barracks where the disease had been detected, to be gassed. This barracks was subsequently sterilized prior to the arrival of hundreds of new occupants, who were deloused and provided with new clothing. Each garrison was subjected to the same procedure. Mengele was inadvertently bestowed with the War Merit Cross and promoted to senior first physician of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944 in retaliation for his efforts to eradicate disease outbreaks at the concentration camp. This incident was not an isolated occurrence. According to numerous accounts, Mengele simultaneously confined hundreds of individuals in the gas chamber as a preventative measure against the disease. Especially ruthless was his treatment of the Romani prisoners at Auschwitz. However, without a doubt, his most heinous deed was at the end of 1944, when he ordered the execution of thousands of Jews because the camp's rations of 700 calories per day for prisoners could no longer be sustained. Although Mengele executed ruthless measures to combat disease and organize other mass executions at Auschwitz, his experiments conducted at the camp have earned him the most notorious reputation. Mengele regarded Auschwitz as an enormous laboratory where he could further his investigations into heredity and genetics, which he had initiated in the mid-1930s. With this mindset, he regarded the prisoners of Auschwitz as expendable research material, analogous to how a chemist might handle the compounds in his laboratory. He had a special fascination with individuals who were affected by dwarfism and heterochromia iridum, a condition characterized by the possession of two eyes of distinct colors. His methods were frequently ruthless. In order to alter the color of the irises, he injected compounds into the eyes of individuals with heterochromia iridum in one experiment. Following a thorough examination of the subjects to the greatest extent that he deemed feasible, he would frequently administer lethal injections or personally execute them so that their skeletons could be preserved for future scientific investigation and their internal organs could be examined. One of the most alarming experiments conducted by Mengele was the unanesthetized removal of organs from certain subjects. A man who underwent this procedure to remove one of his kidneys was returned to work without pain medication. Mengele's research on identical twins at Auschwitz, with whom he developed an obsession for the study of heredity and other characteristics, earned him widespread notoriety. Mengele frequently searched the gangway adjacent to the train station at the camp during the selection of newly arrived individuals for twins in order to further his research. Generally, these were identical twins who frequently arrived at the same location. However, there is evidence that Mengele examined a set of twins who were almost 70 years old. Exactly how many sets of twins he investigated at Auschwitz is unknown, but Mengele is said to have identified and examined at least 175 sets of twins during the summer of 1944, when 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered en masse at Auschwitz. An unexpected turn of events led to the possibility that being a twin could initially aid an individual in surviving Auschwitz. Numerous individuals who were chosen in this manner by Mengele would have likely been sent directly to the gas chambers had he not done so, and his twin subjects were also provided with a higher standard of nutrition than the vast majority of camp detainees. They were frequently allowed to retain their personal attire and were not required to shave their skulls, in contrast to the standard issue uniforms that were provided to all other inmates at Auschwitz. A significant portion of Mengele's research entailed conducting measurements and other apparently mundane examinations of the twins. Subsequent witness testimony indicated that Mengele's work was extraordinarily comprehensive. Accurate measurements were obtained of the skulls and other facial features of the siblings. Later, one twin who survived Auschwitz recalled that Mengele spent roughly 2 hours measuring his and his twin brother's irises. For several months, such examinations could take place twice or thrice per week, during which time photographs were also captured. It appears that the purpose of this was for Mengele to document even the tiniest physical differences that might have existed between identical and non-identical siblings. However, there was an even more malevolent element to this situation as well. Mengele would frequently induce discomfort in one twin to observe whether or not it affected the other. As well as employing chemicals, subjects were injected with unidentified substances. In the cruelest sense, Mengele's research on twins included the examination of their internal organs. As such, he routinely dissected sets of twins after injecting them with chloroform. Once, he suspected that a set of Romani twins were infected with tuberculosis. To confirm this suspicion, he merely executed them and conducted an autopsy. Mengele had erred in his presumptions. The infants lacked tuberculosis. Most remarkable was Mengele's straightforward method of psychologically distancing himself entirely from the act of homicide. Subsequent accounts from Auschwitz first-hand witnesses, including Jewish physicians coerced into serving as Mengele's lab assistants, indicated that Mengele occasionally exhibited benevolence towards the twins and other research subjects under his care. Frequently, he would deliver confections or candies to them while inquiring about their well-being. However, mere minutes later, he was able to execute them as if the incident were nothing. Evidently, Mengele was so preoccupied with his research that he disregarded conventional moral considerations. Furthermore, his complete indoctrination with Nazi ideology and the notion of Aryan racial hierarchy conditioned him to believe that the scientific advancement of the Nazi regime could justify the murder of ostensibly less developed races. Terrifying was the outcome. A certain individual hummed Italian operas to himself as he dissected the organs of victims he had just executed minutes prior for no other purpose than to study them. As a result, it is unsurprising that Mengele acquired the moniker the Angel of Death during his time at Auschwitz, partially due to his pervasive visibility during the selection and the general awareness surrounding his experiments. Thankfully, the investigations would conclude shortly thereafter. Throughout 1944, as the Russian advance into Poland along the Eastern Front continued, the SS initiated the process of dismantling the concentration centers and obliterating any remaining evidence. Early in the winter, preparations were initiated to evacuate Auschwitz. Furthermore, on January 27, 1945, the advancing Soviet forces would ultimately achieve the liberation of the area. Mengele departed comparatively belatedly. He was transferred to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia on January 17. Although he carried along substantial portions of his research samples and copious notes, the majority was abandoned. His tenure at Gross-Rosen was brief, and he was compelled to depart by mid-February, narrowly evading the Soviet armies once more. This marked the inception of an ongoing endeavor to evade the advancing adversary. Over the subsequent 3 months, Mengele attempted to conceal his identity by moving ever further westward. He had arrived in the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia by early May. He would have obtained the news of Hitler's suicide in Berlin on April 30, 1945, and the subsequent collapse of the Third Reich in the days that followed, from this location. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel formally surrendered Germany in Berlin on May 8, thereby concluding the Second World War in Europe. Mengele became a target once the conflict had concluded. Following the conclusion of the war, the Allies had resolved not to exact an undue amount of vengeance on Germany. However, it had been reached that individuals occupying high-ranking positions within the government would face legal action for war crimes, with a particular focus on those who had been affiliated with the SS and oversaw the concentration centers. One of them would be Mengele. He was cognizant of the fact that he had to maintain a strategic advantage over those who sought to capture him. He returned to Germany on the evening of May 8, mere hours after the formal conclusion of the conflict, while attempting to conceal his SS affiliation by assuming the guise of an ordinary German soldier. This went on for several weeks. He narrowly escaped apprehension in mid-June, when he was present when approximately 10,000 German soldiers were detained collectively for interrogation. However, a few days later, when his unit was apprehended by an American division, he was ultimately apprehended. What is noteworthy about the subsequent events is that Mengele revealed his true identity to his interrogators. It was even documented as such by those interrogating him. However, the precise identity of the individual, being a high-ranking SS member and the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, which had been unmistakably documented by this point, was not understood at the time. He was included on a list of sought high-profile war criminals in April 1945. This was the closest Mengele ever came to facing legal consequences. He was transported between detention facilities for several weeks prior to his eventual release in September 1945. His independence appeared to have been secured by the fact that he did not sport one of the blood group tattoos that were commonly affixed to SS members. Mengele rejected this proposition upon his enlistment in the paramilitary organization in 1938. This decision has now resulted in his liberation. Later in September 1945, he was discharged in the town of Ingolstadt and continued his journey towards the city of Donuith. During this period, American and Allied forces continued to conduct routine inspections and interrogations of Germans in every town and village throughout the country. Thus it transpired that he started to self-identify as Fritz Ullmann, consistent with some paperwork he possessed that had been formerly owned by an acquaintance bearing the same name. He later marginally revised these to read Fritz Hollmann. An additional near miss in Donuith prompted him to proceed towards the eastern German region occupied by Russia. He ultimately succeeded in communicating to his spouse, Irene, that he was in a secure location and evading capture. Already, Irene Mengele had been subjected to numerous inquiries regarding the whereabouts of her spouse. This marked the commencement of an extended period during the post-war period during which Mengele moved ceaselessly throughout Germany. His mental state was anything but holy level at this time. Unbelievably, a couple with whom he spent some time in late 1945 recalled him as saying he had resolved to surrender to the authorities at Auschwitz provided he were granted a fair trial, and that he had made every effort to ameliorate the situation there. After returning to southern Germany in the early winter of 1945, he eventually secured a position as a farmhand in the foothills of the Alps. He was employed by the Fischers at this location using the alias Fritz Hollmann. The Fischers quickly developed suspicions that their new lodger was a fugitive, not least because Mengele frequently vented his resentment regarding the post-war settlement and referred to the Allies as the Crusaders, who had invaded Germany. Soon after, he regained communication with his spouse, and over the subsequent months, she would pay him covert visits on occasion. During the years that followed, he lived this way while the Allies made intermittent attempts to locate him. However, these were frequently half-hearted. Lacking any documented evidence of his whereabouts or sightings, a great number of individuals presumed Mengele to have already expired, mirroring the fate of numerous high-ranking Nazi war criminals who simply vanished in the post-war period. In 1949, Mengele ultimately made the decision to depart Europe permanently. This was accomplished through the utilization of the rat line, an intricate network of Nazi-supporting individuals who employed diverse strategies to smuggle former Nazis who had been concealing out of Germany. Mengele, with the aid of a number of individuals, traversed the German-Italian frontier and arrived in the northwestern Italian city of Genoa in the middle of April 1949. During this time, he obtained a passport from the Red Cross under the guise of Helmut Gregor, and departed for South America during the summer. As a consequence of the animosity between the Argentine regime and the United States, the Argentine government was especially receptive to former Nazis. Similarly, a number of Latin American nations perceived assistance to German war criminals as an act of resistance against the neo-imperialistic policies of the United States in Central and South America. Furthermore, prior to the conclusion of the war, the Nazis dispatched enormous quantities of cash and material products to Argentina. It was these that purchased the relative freedom of a great number of individuals there after 1945. Subsequently, Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, two of the primary architects of the Holocaust, were permitted to reside in Argentina without arousal for an extended period of time. Early in 1949, Mengele established his initial residence in Buenos Aires. In the years that followed, Mengele established a new existence in South America in a gradual fashion. He was a traveling salesman for a time, specializing in agricultural machinery that he had acquired first-hand experience with while working on the Fischer family property in southern Germany. After residing with a Nazi sympathizer for a period of time, he subsequently purchased his own residence in Buenos Aires. From Germany, some family funds were transferred to him in Argentina. This was sufficient for him to purchase an interest in a carpentry business and rent a home shortly thereafter. Additionally, it is likely that he engaged in medical practice without a valid medical license during this period. For instance, historical documents indicate that Mengele may have been a participant in the coordination of unlawful abortions. His family life was also altered. Irene Mengele, his wife, remained steadfast in their devotion amidst the atrocities of Auschwitz and the aftermath, yet she exhibited a reluctance to depart Germany for South America. Following their divorce in 1954, Mengele entered into a second marriage with Martha Mengele, his bereaved sister-in-law, 4 years later. Mengele had previously been married to his brother Karl, and she had accompanied him to South America. Due to the laxity of surveillance surrounding Mengele, he was permitted to visit his son for a limited period in Europe during the mid-1950s before returning to Argentina under his real name. The primary reason Josef Mengele managed to evade detection in plain sight throughout this period was because no one was actively seeking him. By the late 1940s, both the German authorities and the Allies had deduced his demise. Despite being brought to the attention of the Argentine authorities, this transpired. Mengele was not charged in 1958, despite the fact that he and a number of other physicians were questioned regarding a network of medical professionals who had been conducting unlawful abortions. However, the episode instilled in him sufficient apprehension that he chose to relocate once more. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, he made several stops throughout South America, momentarily settling in Bolivia and Paraguay. By adopting this prudent strategy, he managed to evade a second detention in the summer of 1960. The Israeli Secret Service agency Mossad conducted an assault on the residence of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in mid-May of that year. They were making preparations to apprehend Mengele after receiving information regarding his probable whereabouts. However, Mengele was already in Bolivia at the moment. Eichmann was extradited to Israel, where he was tried in the most sensational prosecution of a Nazi war criminal since the 1945 and 1946 Nuremberg trials. In that location in 1962, he was executed after being declared guilty. Notwithstanding the perilous predicament Mengele encountered in 1960, and notwithstanding the revelation to international Nazi pursuers including Simon Wiesenthal that Mengele was indeed alive and residing in South America, he made a brief return to West Germany in the aftermath. After that, he moved to Brazil, where he resided on a farm near São Paulo that belonged to Wolfgang Gerhard, a Nazi sympathizer, while Martha, his second wife, spent some time in Italy. During this period, Mengele was the subject of intense pursuit by Israeli agents and others who attempted to locate him and obtain his extradition from Latin America. Thus, it is frequently challenging to ascertain the precise location of Mengele at any given moment. Mossad had obtained intelligence at one point in 1962 that he was in Egypt. Whether or not this is true, it is uncertain. However, Mengele continued to hide primarily in South America with the assistance of Nazi sympathizers Gerhard and Geza and Gitta Stammer, two Hungarian expatriates. These enabled him to amass additional hideouts in the Brazilian São Paulo metropolitan area during the 1960s. Their assistance was also extended to Mengele, who assumed the identity of Gerhard as the German returned to Europe for family medical treatment. Josef Mengele would spend the remainder of his life evading justice. In the end, he passed away on February 7, 1979, following years of deteriorating health. He had previously suffered a cerebrovascular accident in 1976 and was concurrently afflicted with various medical conditions, such as hypertension. His demise at the time was precipitated by a second stroke that occurred while he was swimming in the Brazilian coastal town of Bertioga. Drowning is identified as the cause of his demise. He had nearly attained his 70th birthday, which positioned him among the most elderly among the notorious war criminals of the Nazi era. Furthermore, his son Rolf had paid his father a visit in São Paulo 2 years prior. It was his first encounter as an adult with his father in over 2 decades, during which time he had not seen him. His much later recollections of his father revealed him to be a man who, more than 3 decades after the end of the war, continued to deny any culpability for his actions at Auschwitz, attributing them to his responsibilities as an SS officer. His father, according to Rolf Mengele, was an unrepentant Nazi. One concluding twist concluded the account of his evasion of justice. The global community remained uninformed regarding Mengele's demise for an extended period of time, while Nazi pursuers, including Simon Wiesenthal, persistently endeavored to trace the Angel of Auschwitz, with the regrettably intended consequence of bringing him to justice. It was not until 1985, when intelligence uncovered a cache of Mengele's correspondence in Günzburg, Germany, his birthplace, that it was discovered he had passed away several years prior. In Brazil, an investigation was conducted in an attempt to determine the location of his burial. Subsequent to the success of these efforts, it became apparent that Mengele had been interred at Embu das Artes, located in close proximity to São Paulo, Brazil, under the assumed identity of Wolfgang Gerhard, the individual who had provided him with shelter and assistance many years prior. As a result, his remains were exhumed during the summer of 1985, and a thorough examination established a strong suspicion that they belonged to Rolf Mengele. This conclusion was subsequently corroborated by Mengele himself. Never was it reinterred. The skeleton of the individual who once executed individuals at Auschwitz for the sole purpose of examining their organs is currently utilized as an educational resource at the University of São Paulo's medical school. What should be said when assessing an individual such as Josef Mengele? As we have seen, this individual was abhorrent. He appears to have had no regard or compassion for the people he murdered and experimented on, whether in an attempt to prevent the spread of disease at Auschwitz or in the course of his experiments. It may be worthwhile to consider how he came to be known as the Angel of Death. Mengele did not join the Nazi Party until 1937. Prior to the mid-1930s, he attempted to merge the fields of anthropology and human features through his work as a medical student. He was, according to those who knew him, an affable individual, and scholars have since determined that his early work is not problematic. Rather than being imbued with prejudice or hostility towards others, it could have been interpreted as a valid scientific publication from the interwar era. Mengele, prior to his association with the Nazis, exhibited certain similarities to Albert Speer, the architect who subsequently assumed the position of German Minister of War Production. Both were middle-class academics with promising careers ahead of them prior to the rise of the Nazis and their subsequent activities. Both individuals had not exhibited any conspicuous manifestations of antisemitism or the ability to commit mass slaughter. However, in early 1937, Mengele initiated his research on racial anthropology under the tutelage of Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer in Frankfurt, and shortly thereafter, he aligned himself with the Nazis and underwent a radical intellectual transformation. By the conclusion of 1938, he had a dual membership in the Waffen-SS and the Nazi Party, the latter being the most extremist faction among the numerous paramilitary organizations under Nazi regime. After the invasion of Poland in September 1939, he joined the war effort with utmost enthusiasm in this capacity. From the outset, a portion of his endeavors revolved around the notion of purported racial purity. However, his ordeal reached its pinnacle at Auschwitz from the summer of 1943 until January 1945, when he escaped the camp. During this brief period of 20 months, Mengele personally oversaw the execution of thousands of individuals and, in numerous cases, carried out the injections that killed the subjects of his experiments. Quantel, for instance, sewed two individuals together in a peculiar test involving conjoined twins. Such experiments ranged from the vile to the utterly surreal. They passed away several days later due to gangrene-infected incisions. Mengele undoubtedly portended impending doom at Auschwitz throughout his sojourn there. Nonetheless, Josef Mengele ultimately evaded retribution. He evaded apprehension for more than 3 decades, traversing numerous nations and locations, occasionally returning to Europe and ostensibly navigating Latin America. Additionally, it is remarkable how many individuals were willing to assist Mengele, who was responsible for the atrocities he had committed. However, he was also quite fortunate. In 1945, he was apprehended by the Allies and subsequently released solely on the grounds that he lacked the blood group tattoo that was mandatory for almost all SS members. In the years and decades that followed, he narrowly evaded apprehension on a number of additional occasions, most notably in 1960 in Buenos Aires, where Adolf Eichmann was apprehended. Although Mengele managed to evade retribution during his lifetime, his heinous deeds shall perpetually elude remembrance. In your opinion, what is Josef Mengele? In what way did he become arguably the most vicious Nazi in his time? And what precipitated his abrupt transformation of personality beginning in 1937? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.